It's really my pleasure to introduce today's lecturer, Dr. Oren Shlomo, who's a faculty member in the Department of Sociology, Political Science, and Communication at the Open University of Israel. Oren works in the fields of political geography and urban policy and governance, focusing on political and environmental conflicts, mainly in the Israeli-Palestinian context. He was a postdoctoral fellow at our Minerva Center during the 2019-2020, where he worked on shifts in urban politics in East Jerusalem, and that's the work that he's going to be presenting here today. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the School of Sustainability at the IDC in Herzliya, and a Fulbright postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Urban Planning and Design at the Harvard University. So without further introduction, from contested sovereignty to urban politics, Palestinians' rights claiming and assessing the state in post-Oslo East Jerusalem. Oren will present now. We'll have time for discussion. The discussion will take place in English, but if any of the, particularly the students, would prefer asking in Hebrew, that's also fine. Oren.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. It's really a pleasure to come back again to the Minerva Center. We had excellent, interesting time last year, so it's good to have this follow-up to the work that I did in the center. Let me share my presentation and we will start right away. Okay, so today's talks will focus on the research I conducted in the center last year. And it's dealing with perhaps a shift in Palestinians in East Jerusalem in claiming claims and protest to social and urban rights vis-a-vis Israeli governance. This is apparently it's a new development in the urban politics in East Jerusalem, which embedded in a larger transformation that occurring in the city in the last 20 years since the collapse of the Oslo Accords. But let me start with a brief review about East Jerusalem for those of you who are not so familiar with the urban and spatial and political constellation of East Jerusalem. So what you see here in the map in green is the green line. The blue line is the new municipality line after Israel annexed some areas from the West Bank and expand the municipal border of Jerusalem and included the new East Jerusalem within this border. There are 28 villages and Palestinian neighborhoods in this area. On the continuum, urban continuum between Ramallah and Bethlehem. And since then, Israel put a lot of effort in order to break and divide this continuum through building of neighborhoods and settlements for Jewish Israeli settlements and neighborhoods. What you see in red here is the separation wall, which separate East Jerusalem and Jerusalem itself from the West Bank. So in East Jerusalem, there are approximately about 300,000, between 300,000 and 370,000 Palestinians. If we consider East Jerusalem as a city by itself, it will be a city bigger than Haifa, yeah? A little bit smaller than Tel Aviv, but considerably bigger than Haifa. So it's the largest Palestinian city within Israeli sovereignty. The Palestinians in East Jerusalem, they don't hold Israeli citizenship, but they have a conditioned residency status. They have to stay and live in the city. If they leave the city for more than 7 years, they might lose their residency status. The best way to theoretically, as far as theoretical framework, governance theoretical framework, to describe Israel control over East Jerusalem is a settler colonial governmental regime in which there is an Israeli political and demographic expansion into Palestinian areas, accompanied by land expropriation, institutional discrimination, and political oppression. There is, of course, alongside, as we know from the political history of Jerusalem, Palestinian resistance to Israeli rule in East Jerusalem, the two intifadas, as we all know, and the urban intifada, as they call it in the press, of 2014 and 2015. Palestinians are boycotting the municipal election because they don't acknowledge the legitimacy of Israeli rule over there. In terms of urban theory, the neighborhoods and villages, the Palestinian neighborhood and villages in East Jerusalem may resemble what we call in critical urban theory informal urban spaces or gray spaces. That means areas that are not fully legal in terms of construction, in terms of legal status of their dwellers, in terms of construction, land registration, land tenure, and so on. Most likely are lack with infrastructure and services and other services, and not fully, of course, excluded in the formal economy and in the formal politics. Usually the groups who inhabit these areas are excluded groups, ethnic minorities, religion group, the urban poor of the global south. We know these characters, or these urban characters, mostly relate to what we know as the favelas in South America or other slums or slums neighborhoods in Asia, shanty towns, the refugee camps of the Middle East. This is a framework that tries to understand the politics and the development and the governance of this area under this umbrella of concepts. So let's get to the presentation itself. And let me start with two quotes. The first is of Professor Menachem Klein from Bar-Ilan University. He researched Jerusalem extensively during the 90s, particularly its place in the peace process, in the Oslo peace process. And he wrote his final comprehensive book published in 1999. And in his book, he's writing, quoting, "The East Jerusalem Palestinians reject Israeli national symbols and have no demands for the improvement of their daily life. They see Israeli government decisions to invest in the development of East Jerusalem infrastructure as another type of conquest and of the imposition of Israeli identity, and not as a government obligation to the residents of its territory." So this is Menachem Klein in 1999. And exactly 20 years later, the former mayor of Jerusalem, Nir Barkat, publishes his autobiography. And in his autobiography, he's writing, quoting, "There has never been a demonstration that made me happy like the demonstration of parents from an East Jerusalem school in protest of a service they did not receive, which was held in the front of the town hall at the Safra Square. I was happy that they were protesting against the municipality and not against the Palestinian Authority, as they see us as their service supplier and demand it from us. The demonstration was a significant milestone. We have established the fact that Jerusalem municipality is the sovereign." So obviously these two quotes, there's a big gap in political attitude and in the issues of urban protest and urban mobilization and of relations between state and society in East Jerusalem, which I will try to clarify or analyze in this lecture. So a little bit of theory of how we can take a look, or how we might understand this gap, or what happens in the research, what the research says about urban mobilization and urban social movements, particularly in urban reality of informal settlements. So there's a wide and rich literature about urban social movement and urban protest and urban politics that comes from the global north, from cities in the north. Writers and theorists in this line of inquiry, in this literature, usually conceived the urban arena as the cradle, of course, of democracy and liberalism. It comes from the Greek police and so on, and of urban movements and protests as manifestation of democratization. That means the urban arena is a generator of politics, generator of grassroots movement, and generator of claims of movements and of communities in order to gain right, in order to actualize right, and in order to actualize their citizenship. So this is embedded in, of course, in liberal urban ethos. And we have, of course, huge and large examples for this phenomenon from the 1960s urban movement of San Francisco, the gay movement in San Francisco, the civil rights movement, to the Occupy movement and the Arab Spring in the last decade. So the urban arena plays a significant role, and urban movement and urban protest play a significant role in processes of democratization, according to what we know from the north. And however, in the global south, there's a little bit of different literature, a different perspective, since the urban south, or cities in the global south, or metropolises of the urban south, accompanies large areas of what I mentioned as urban informalities. And the literature that comes from this perspective identify different forms of politics that comes from what Asef Bayet called the politics of the informal people. These slums dwellers or informal settlements dwellers had different tactics and different techniques in order to make claims and encounter state and authority, mainly bureaucracy and administration, in order to gain some rights, to improve their surrounding, and to get access to resources. The reason for that is precisely because they are excluded from formal political, usually excluded from formal political processes, and have to invent new ways to create some local politics. The examples that comes from this literature is politics of theft, or concepts that comes from this literature is politics of theft, clientelism, politics of favors, and or what Asef Bayet called the everyday encroachment of the ordinary people, and so on. There's an important distinguish in this literature that comes from Partha Chatterjee, when he identified two forms of politics that comes from civil society versus political society, where civil society is the politics of the elite and the middle class that mediated mainly through NGOs and formal politics, and political society, which are the grassroots communities and informal politics of the informal people. So this is an interesting, important distinction that I might use later. There's another important strands of writing that look at how informal politics changes and transforms in these areas into a language of rights. That is a shift between informal politics and how it's via mediation of NGOs and elite politics, it become a politics of rights that plays by legal system and formal campaigns and formal ways of grassroots politics that resemble what we know from the global and north cities. But there's some important concepts that come from this literature is, for example, insurgent citizenship that comes from the work of James Holston in the favelas in Brazil, Urban citizenship, it's a concept that represent the capacity and ability of local governments to provide protection and rights to undocumented citizen or excluded groups, and of course, right to the city that represent the bundle of rights that residents or undocumented residents can acquire on the basis of residency in cities with no connection to their formal citizenship. But so this writing and also empirics from this case study, of course, arises some questions regarding East Jerusalem. I think the first and important one is to what extent there is perhaps a transition in state-society relation in East Jerusalem, or what has happened between these two codes that I mentioned earlier. What are the conditions, the enabling condition for this perhaps transitions of Palestinians in right claiming in East Jerusalem, and what's its significant in terms of theory and in terms of the capacity of the state to shape or to control political subjectivities in East Jerusalem and civic participation among its subjects, when they are not citizen, and furthermore they reject the legitimacy of the governance apparatus. So between Klein and Barkat, if we go to address the first questions, maybe we should talk about earlier period. So as far as urban politics or politics of development or Palestinians are claims for improvement, infrastructure, social rights, and so on, before the 90s, during the 70s and 80s, and maybe also around the 90s, Palestinians usually used to make claims on the state via the institution of the Muhtar, who used to have a direct line to the mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, sometimes with the mediation of the Arab affair advisor of the mayor, in a way that we can call, according to what we know in the literature, a politics of favors or clientelism. So it wasn't a form of formal politics. Palestinians did it publicly. It was deals and conversation and that been closed between the mayor and the muhtars and the local leaders. During the 90s, the Palestinian Authority and the Fatah movement gained control and dominancy in East Jerusalem. And the Orient House was quite of a central governmental branch and was the address for Palestinian problems. And also in the 90s, Palestinians did not have a direct a channel to claim rights or any kinds of rights from Israeli governance system or Israeli authorities. What we have after the collapse of the Oslo Accords, I think most of the research that conducted after the collapse of the Oslo Accords and around the 2000 builds on I think the seminal work of Hillel Cohen and the book that he wrote about the fall of Arab Jerusalem. And in his book, he's describing how the peace process and the consequences of the collapse of the Oslo Accord turned East Jerusalem from the cultural, religion, economic, social center of the West Bank, turned it into a collage of neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, poor urban area that captured, trapped in the Israeli space, in the Israeli functional space, while its affinities with the West Bank are being cut off, and it's prone to, and it's subjected more and more to Israeli rule, making the or creating a deep process of urban decline in East Jerusalem. So he called this process as the fall of Arab Jerusalem, as it lost its centrality, its urban centrality in the West Bank. Of course, it connected to processes of the where Ramallah gained urban dominancy in the West Bank and so on. So this this perspective opened up a door for a new stage in the research of Jerusalem and the governance in Jerusalem. Where I did my PhD, I looked at how Israel took over urban services and infrastructure that being managed traditionally by Palestinians during the 70s and 80s and 90s. And during the 2000s, Israel took over in management, in financing, in administrating. And today, the systems that I looked at, community health, public transport, and education, they are, most of them, large parts of them are Israeli affiliated. So I call this process as governmentalization of East Jerusalem, where I see infrastructure and services as also means of power, as challenges of power, and not only of instrument to deliver public goods. So this is another perspective to look at Jerusalem. There are other writers that look at this period of transformation, urban transformation, and political transformation in East Jerusalem. Nir Chasson, for example, from Haaretz, he called this process as the Israelization of East Jerusalem, and he looked also on a different evidence that show us growing affinities between Palestinians in East Jerusalem to the Israeli administration and economy. On top of that, we can add the government decision number 3790, who promised to deliver 2.2 billion shekels in economic development in East Jerusalem in the fields of education, employment, welfare, and so on. This is happening after the urban intifada of 2014, 2015, the kids intifada, that's how they call it in the press. And the Israeli government come to a conclusion that it has to develop and put some effort in developing and stabilizing East Jerusalem in terms of economy, education, and so on. The results of these processes are, for example, our growth in implementation of Israeli curriculum in Palestinian school and in the Arab education in East Jerusalem. There's a huge demand for Hebrew language learning in citizenship applications. There is growing integration in the job market. There are new shared spaces in Jerusalem, usually mainly around shopping malls and shopping centers. There are some growth in coexistence initiatives, and so on. So what we see here, we see a city in transition, which changes its social characters. I'm not sure that it goes to be a mixed city like other mixed cities in Israel. I call this process in my latest article as a subordinated integration. That means there is an integration, but it builds on dependency and it builds on forced adaptation of Palestinians to Israeli rule, while some other political oppression and discrimination in terms of planning and house demolition and displacement of Palestinians by settlers organization and so on continues. So there's a parallel lines here and all kind of contradiction within the governance that needs to be clarified. And on top of this development that goes between what I call the Klein and Barkat, there is some evidence that Palestinian attitudes towards claiming rights directly from the Israeli state via language of rights and means that usually utilized by civil society, there are some evidence that may let us think that there is a shift in this arena also. one of the quotes, or one of the strong evidence I got for this procedure or development, I got from a central Palestinian activist who I interviewed during the research, and he told me, quoting, "The legend that more than the calf wants to suckle, the cow wants to nurse, died long time ago. Today there is a new pragmatism. Today we don't ask whether to recognize the occupier or not. Today we ask what the occupier must do for us." So there's a kind of, according to this person, there is a shift, pragmatic shift. It's not a political shift of encountering or getting associated with, in terms of the getting along with the Israeli state or with its governmental apparatus, but it's a pure pragmatic development through which Palestinians tried to gain some improvement in the terms of development and urban and social rights. So we see this in few more or less famous struggles of Palestinians against Israeli authorities, or in order to gain actualization of their rights or improvements. There were some quite famous, or more or less famous, neighborhood struggles against discriminative planning in Atur and Isawiya during the 2012 and 2014. I looked thoroughly through these neighborhood struggles, specifically on the Bet Safafa village struggle against the development of road number 4, which constructed through the village and divided the village into two parts. The communities in these villages conducted demonstration. They used the media in order to spread their claims. The demonstration held along highways around the villages. The Bet Safafa struggle got into the demonstration held also in the city square, in the Safra Hall city square, and they attract a lot of media coverage. These struggles also accompanied by legal proceedings against the state. All of them failed, but there was kind of a feeling that there is a new practices of mobilization and political organization on a civil base in East Jerusalem, since the vision of seeing Palestinians protest in West Jerusalem, particularly in the city hall, that's something that we could not imagine during the 90s or 70s or 80s. This is a whole new thing. So another examples are legal proceedings that conducted against the state in all kind of fields, with collaborating with Israeli NGO, the Israeli Human Rights Association, the Hamoked Laganat Aprat, and others like BIMCOM, planners for planning rights, and so on in the fields of education. For example, this is one famous legal proceeding that was successful, as the High Court of Justice of Israel ruled that the state has to fill up the gap in classroom shortage in East Jerusalem, in order to obey to the Israeli educational law. And if not, the city has to pay parents the private tuitions that they pay to the private schools that they send the students go to. There are another very famous, discussed in the media. It was the struggle of the Al-Quds University medicine students, who started a legal proceedings against the Ministry of Health in Israel as they demand to participate in the professional registration exams of the Ministry of Health in order to join the to work in their profession within Israel. The state claimed that Al-Quds University is not a broad university. It's not a university that located abroad, but it's not a university that is under the authority of the Israeli Education Ministry. So it's kind of in limbo, and there's nothing that the state can do, and so forth. But this was also a successive. This was also a struggle that ends up with success. Both of these struggles, of course, accompanied with demonstrations and with collaboration with professional networks. The students, for example, they collaborate with Israeli hospitals and with Israeli professionals and professional association in their field. And of course demonstration, and you can read about at that period you could read about the education dispute in East Jerusalem in the Guardian, in the New York Times. So there was a quite of a work that has been done here in learning the field and how to gain influence in this struggle. Another example is a parents committee in 2006. The Parent Committee Union of East Jerusalem was established. It consists 90% of the school in Arab Jerusalem, and this committee was working with and against the municipality on the basis of demanding educational rights and protecting the Arab Palestinian curriculum in East Jerusalem. They also use media campaigns and strikes, and they're considered as one of the, at least back then, 5-6 years ago, as one of the promising local new leadership, which is not national leadership and it's not connected to any Palestinian party, that can bring to some changes and bring some development and progress in the field of education in East Jerusalem. And of course, they've been praised by Israeli NGOs, but they gained a suspicion attitude from the city and from the Ministry of Education. Another example is workers, mainly drivers from the companies Kavim and Eget Ta'avura, several hundreds of them who organized in Israeli-based labor union, Koach La'ovdim, which is a democratic labor union where the workers are conducting their struggles by themselves. That means taking the decisions of strikes, on signing agreements with employers, tactics of struggles and protests, and so on. This is an interesting development, and it's quite unique as Palestinian workers are struggle and protest with their Israeli colleagues. Interesting and prominent example is that the leaders of these two subunions are from East Jerusalem, and they've been elected by the national union of the drivers, which elect Palestinians from East Jerusalem to lead the protest. So this is a very important kind of integrated struggle between East Jerusalem and Israel. So this is a very interesting examples that builds the sense of shifting or transformation or of something changes comparing to what we know from the 90s and 90s, 80s, and of course the 70s. In terms of governmental reaction to these developments, or to each one of these developments or struggles, so usually activists has to be very careful because they knew they were about to get arrested by security service or by the police. The chair of the Union of Parent Committees of East Jerusalem been arrested by the securities. He was arrested by the security services in all kind of different accusations. His computers been checked and so on. Demonstration that been held. It was like what I termed a transgressive demonstration, which are considered largely as part of the game, were harshly got a harsh policing in usually in the locations around the villages. Demonstration that been held in the city hall were a quiet demonstration with no interfering of the police, but other were harshly policed by the police. And in some cases, there were involvement, as I mentioned, of the security services. Israel tend to shut down every NGO or every struggle that has some kind of affinity to the Palestinian Authority. So all these struggles has to be very much neutral and not to create any visible connection with Palestinian parties or Palestinian funding and so on. And the main governmental reaction, as I explained before, is investment, is development. So the answer of Israel, more likely that comes on top of these developments, is pushing all kind of initiatives of integration, mainly through project that comes from that relate to the decision of 3790. So this is more or less how the government react. And if I want to go to discuss a little bit of these developments or to conclude, so I'm not sure that there is a transformation in urban politics in East Jerusalem, at least in the sense of shifting in urban politics. Means that I don't think that we can expect to see any large urban movements or urban protests that will develop in order to shift state and society relation in East Jerusalem in terms of urban rights. At least this is what happens today. All these initiatives and developments and examples that I demonstrated in this presentation were conducted during the between 2008, 2006, and until the 2014, 2015. Since then, Palestinian urban rights in direct protest vis-a-vis Israel governance has declined. I guess it's because I guess it's connected to what happened to the events of 2014, 2015, and the urban violence and the kidnapping of Muhammad al-Khadir and all the consequences of these incidents. So I'm not sure that we go over there in terms of urban politics, but what we see, on the other hand, is governance by development. So this is a quite well-known narrative from the southern urbanities, or how government tend to conduct slums and informal urban areas, as they see these excluded groups as objects of administration and of development, and not as citizens. So this is a distinction that we can also try to understand it in relation to East Jerusalem, and how the 3790 decision construct a narrative of development and progress, while the narrative of citizenship is or narrative of urban citizenship is not pretty much gaining any development or support from local authorities or from the Israel or from national authorities. And of course, the downside of this development is the eroding of the national narrative, the national collective narrative. As these small struggles and as this governance by development, where the government deals with each neighborhood and each village by itself, eroding collective awareness or collective national empowerment. And of course, it's against the Israeli interest to develop this kind of national awareness and identity. But in the long run, if we look at the two-state solution and we're looking generally on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, so I think that this transformation and these developments in East Jerusalem are not give us such a hope for the maybe someday arrangement that will divide East Jerusalem to two capitals of Palestine and Israel. So it says something on the horizon of the perhaps it says something on the horizon of the political horizon of the two-state solution. As we know, Jerusalem is a main issue in this conflict. So I think I will end here. It's been 45 minutes, and I think we can open it here for discussion. Thank you everything for listening.
Great. Oren, it was fascinating. I want to mention that this research of Oren's combined with Rotem Rosenberg's research were basically the impetus for a 3-day webinar that took place in July on novel forms of governance, control, and resistance. And I think that thanks to Ido and Michal, we have those on YouTube. So anybody who wants to, it was really fascinating, who wants to listen to even more of this should look at the YouTube video, which is on the Minerva website. Now, I'm going to let Rotem ask the first question because she wrote that she has to leave, unfortunately, early, and then we'll continue on to Itamar, Omri, and I'm sure there are others. Rotem.
Thanks, that's very kind, thank you. And Oren, thank you. It was really fascinating and so interesting to hear about all these processes that are going on and really like thinking about it, you know, about the way it corresponds with my own work. And I have sort of a short comment just off the top of my mind and then a short question, unrelated question. The comment has to do with some of the advantages of urban politics, or rather local politics, rather than national politics. I wonder if some of the people you talk to, if maybe they view it as a certain, I don't know, a certain escape from the regular kind of dichotomy between either being a citizen or not being a citizen, or even maybe between human rights and civil rights. I mean, so I was thinking throughout your presentation about Arendt, about Hannah's work on refugees, and how she points out that in this, ever since the 19th century and the era of nation states, civil rights and human rights have become almost synonymous, and it's almost impossible to separate the two. And this is what makes the refugee this huge challenge, right? A person who is stateless and demands rights only based on his humanity, his or her humanity. And so it occurs to me that maybe in a way, local politics can sort of provide an escape from this. It allows you to ask for rights that are sort of more concrete. They're not just general human rights, but rights and services that, you know, that you're entitled to, and who lives in the state, but without framing it as a sort of civil rights or as a, you know, wanting to become a citizen and a full member of the state. So that's just a thought. And my question is, I thought it was really interesting how a lot of these local sort of initiatives and these processes that are happening are occurring in collaboration with Israeli organizations. And I was wondering whether there are all examples, strong examples of initiatives that do not have this collaboration, whether you noticed some difference, in the way that these two types of initiatives are structured, or in the way that the people involved in them view sort of their relationship with Israel. Thank you.
Thank you for your question and your comment. I will first let me answer the question, because I think I need to clarify something that I didn't say in the presentation. In East Jerusalem, there's a large, huge civil and vital Palestinian civil society that operates in various of fields, from education to welfare to health, to which is disassociated completely from Israeli society and from Israeli authorities and state apparatuses. So they have their own urban cosmos that works and operates and based on external funding and on internal resources and so on. What I mentioned here is like a tip, just a tip comparing to the large Palestinian civil society that don't want any relation with Israeli authority, and they want to operate their own operation by themselves with this association. Of course, resisting and opposing any normalization of Israeli rules. So maybe this gives you a little bit of background to how Palestinians see it. And I think that this example brought a lot of disappointment, since they were not so successful. So if Palestinians tries to encounter Israeli authorities and they're not so successful, so maybe there's now a decline to what we see in the 5 years to local internal. As far as the citizenship issue. So we all know the concept of urban citizenship, which represent exactly what you talked about. It's the capacity and ability of local government to provide protection and rights and services on the basis of residency in the municipality borders or in the area of a municipality. And this concept is gaining a lot of attention in Europe and in the US when we talk about undocumented immigrants and on refugees and on problems of huge and growing diversity of urban population with all its complexity and so on. And I think that also in East Jerusalem, when we talk with a lot of activists, they see themselves, I mean, this urban citizenship, of course, it's give them a space of political expression and identity, kind of a space to perform their what they call a Makdasi identity, like their Jerusalemite identity. And Hillel Cohen write about it in his book when he described how Palestinians in East Jerusalem develop to a certain extent some kind of hybrid identity, which is different than the Palestinian identity of in the West Bank or in Israel or in different places. So I share this view that the urban identity or the connection, of course, to Jerusalem is a very strong, a space. And that gives Palestinians a lot of political power, resisting power, and what they call sumud and so on. Yes, definitely. Did I answer your question? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks.
Oren, thanks. Itamar. By the way, Michal has posted the link to the July webinar. To the 3 days, whoever would like to look at it. It's in the chat. Itamar.
Hi, Oren. Very, very interesting as usual. This is not the first time I listen to your work on East Jerusalem, but every time I come out with new insights, and I really love it. Now, I noticed this time that the actors that are part of your analysis are mainly NGOs. the city itself, the municipality, as well as perhaps one labor organization. And I'm wondering about what actors are not included in the analysis and why these actors are emphasized and perhaps other actors are not as emphasized. And particularly, I'm wondering about the role of political parties, Palestinian political parties. To what extent are they participating in the mobility that you described? And the role of foreign actors. So recently, I think that we have read I at least have read in the press about increased involvement of foreign governments in East Jerusalem, let's say uncharacteristically foreign governments in East Jerusalem, particularly the UAE now and Turkey. And I'm wondering if your research shows any precedent of that. It comes against the backdrop of a historical arrangement with Jordan, where Jordan is also the custodian of the holy places, and from a recent story that I've read, it really sounds like East Jerusalem has become a kind of quiet site for a proxy war between the UAE and Turkey. And I'm wondering if there's any kind of remnant of that in the conversations with the people on the ground at all, and if this has a deeper recent history. Relatedly, I'm wondering about the role of religion. It seems like your analysis is really very much emphasizes day-to-day needs and struggles, which I frankly, personally, think is really very important. And I would also think that those are the questions that kind of on a political level need to be addressed. But I think that another force that may be very much in play in the imaginations of people on the ground are religious forces. And what is the role of a religious imagination in the political processes that you described?
Thank you, Itamar. These are excellent questions, but I must admit that some of them are beyond the scope of this research, because as I defined it, what I was interested initially, it was in this precise area where Palestinians step up and do something different as far as mobilization and address Israeli authorities directly. So this was more or less the scope. So the research sits right on this seam line between grassroots mobilization or local or urban mobilization and the Israeli government. But I can try to draw on some of your questions from what I know and from what I heard and from the interviews I conducted. So as far as Palestinian political parties and how they participate in I didn't exactly know what you meant in
but even for example, in the decision to address Israeli institutions like the city, are political parties involved in that?
Okay, so I think that there is a huge debate and discourse within Palestinian society, and I'm not a Palestinian society scholar, yeah. So I'm talking from a very shallow point of view and from what I heard and from what I discovered. There's a huge discourse within Palestinian society in East Jerusalem. What is normalization? What is considered as normalization with Israeli authority, and what we can do as something that we have to do in order to survive? And there's a big debate over there, and I don't think that the answers are quite strict. For example, to go to enroll to the Hebrew university, is it and to use Israel government scholarship in order to enroll to Hebrew university, is it normalization or not? So there's all kind of opinions, and I think that most of the political parties' views and leaders see what is need to, what gains Palestinians in East Jerusalem can get in order to survive and to progress within the city without without crossing the lines, which I don't really understand what does it mean. But I think maybe this issue, this development show us the expanding of the what is normalization. Okay, this is one way to look at it. As we see more and more, for example, students that from East Jerusalem that enroll to the Hebrew University, we even heard of Palestinians from East Jerusalem that goes to a national service. This is something I was quite surprised to hear about. So there's all kind of development, which I think the development on the ground brings some challenges to political parties and brings some new questions to political parties that they need to deal with and to draw lines with some limitations, because I'm not sure that they have that of a strong influence in East Jerusalem. You know, when they have it, when the Israeli economy and job market and you know opportunities to progress and to get education, and so this is what's stand on the table. So there's I guess there is an internal play and discourse that always changes and shifting. I didn't research it, but I guess this is a very fascinating issue to look at. But what I'm explaining now is what I heard from activists and people whom I work with. As far as foreign workers, yes, of course, this huge arena of Palestinian civil society that has no connection with Israeli authorities builds to a large extent on foreign resources that comes from Turkey, from other actors, including the EU and the US, of course. There's a research that has been done in the Jerusalem Institute for Policy Research that just published 3 months ago. And they did a very detailed mapping of the Palestinian civil society in East Jerusalem, and they name all these foreign workers and how they involved in supporting Palestinian civil society in East Jerusalem, and enables, you know, this anti-normalization and this autonomy of the civil society networks in East Jerusalem. As far as the religion, I don't think anything has changed over there, or you know, this is the strongest pole, or the strongest red line, or the strongest core of identity and of sumud and I don't think this has any connection to things that happen on the periphery as far as surviving or progress or development. The religion is a core issue, which I don't think it's so flexible. We cannot, I think, identify over there any shifts or, you know.
Thanks, Oren. It would be interesting to do some kind of mapping and see how much of the discourse is overtly apolitical. And I'm sure it's
yes.
very mixed.
It's an interesting comment. Sure, you just.
Okay. Marie.
Hi, thank you, Oren, for a really interesting talk. Both for me, it's interesting both academically and personally. Living in Jerusalem, so it's always interesting to hear some sort of reflection about where I am. And my question relates a bit to Itamar's, but maybe a bit more specific, because I recently heard about, and then I did not research, but I looked into how Kupat Cholim, I'm not sure how we call Kupat Cholim in English, but like the medical provider, like specific medical provider in Israel, how Kupat, one of them, Meuchedet, have become really quite dominant in East Jerusalem, and they have way more branches. And from what I heard, it's related to a specific, and this reminded me of Asaf Bayat work that you mentioned. There was someone there who really managed to push things, who was a physician there, and he managed to, they have a new building in Sheikh Jarrah, and they have all these different facilities, and way more East Jerusalem residents go to Meuchedet than they used to the other healthcare providers. And I was thinking how that relates to like how I was thinking about the dichotomies between state and non-state, or and the normalization and what can be done not as normalization, but sort of this complex negotiation with getting some sort of services from state extensions, but without being completely complicit or like all these Althusserian theoretical constructs are interpolated into state ideology. So I was thinking about these more blurred or gray areas between state and non-state, and how there's a play between tactical and strategic cooperation in East Jerusalem that seems to be much more complex than, maybe that's my question, I guess. Is it more complex now than it used to be? Because I'm thinking now also about public transportation, for example, which also seemed to have changed in the last 15 or 20 years, where it's both state, formal and informal, and there's some sort of cooperation there.
Yes, and thank you for your interesting questions about public transportation and health services. Well, I looked thoroughly on these two systems, and I will try to briefly explain what's going on, and it surely relates to the frameworks that you mentioned. During the 70s and 80s, only 50% of Jerusalem Palestinians were insured in Israeli public health insurance. As the new privatization and the new health law in Israel, which privatized to a certain extent the new Kupot Cholim, East Jerusalem became a market for the Kupot Cholim in order to recruit new insurees. But as you mentioned, and as you identified, it is very difficult for the Israeli health provider to operate in East Jerusalem, same as the public transportation Israeli operators, and same as educational initiatives Israeli to work that wants to work in East Jerusalem. So it's a totally a gray area or informal urban area that it's not that the methods and tactic and administrative arrangements that we that works in Israel cannot be operationalized over there. So for this purpose, East Jerusalem is has the Ministry of Health create a specific arrangement for the administrative arrangement and permission to the Israeli health provider to work in East Jerusalem through private public providers. That means outsourcing of their services via Palestinians entrepreneurs. So what you see in East Jerusalem, that every village has a branch of one or two or three of the health suppliers. It's not an organic branch of the Kupat Cholim like you see in Israel. In Israel, the health providers are forbidden from outsource their services to the communities. It has to be an organic operation of theirs. But only in East Jerusalem they have the administrative permission and arrangement to work in this kind of arrangement, and that brings Mukhtar and all kind of influential people in East Jerusalem to open medical centers and to gain the funds and the agreements with the Kupot Cholim and to operate their own clinics over there under, of course, the regulation of the Kupot Cholim that they are associated with. The interesting thing about it that they get paid per capita from the Kupot Cholim, and this is the main problem. So it creates a lot of difficulties and faults in the services that Palestinians from East Jerusalem gain, and a lot of shifts of branches between different Kupot Cholim. That means if I get a better deal from Meuchedet and I have 2,000, 3,000 insurees in my village, maybe I should leave Meuchedet and go with Leumit with my 3,000, 4,000 insurees from the village. And, so this whole kind of a new gray, area that happens over there in this field just because of this exemption of the healthcare arrangements. By the way, it's the same principle in the public transportation system that you mentioned before. As you know, Dan, Egged, Kavim, Metro, they're not operating in East Jerusalem, but the local companies, the Palestinian companies, have the authority from the Israeli Transportation Ministry to operate a legal operation in East Jerusalem. And by the time that Israel reorganized the public transportation in East Jerusalem, there were 16 companies, 16 public transportation providers in East Jerusalem, while at the same time there were 16 public transportation companies in all of Israel. So there's this arrangement, this exempt arrangement or a special arrangement that the government create in order to be able to operate in urban informal areas are not unique to Israel. We see it all over in the global south when the government or private companies want to deliver services in shanty towns, refugee camps, favelas, and so on. There's all kinds of tactics and administrative special arrangement that created specifically to these areas with agreements with the power people from the community, with the people that have the social authority, the local social authority, and so on. And Jerusalem is not exception in this. East Jerusalem is not exception in this term. I looked at the public transportation, education, and also health services, and it's the same pattern of what I called sub-formality. So it's not like informal services, but it's not formal services. It's somewhere in between, and I termed it as a sub-formal arrangements of public services that Israel conduct over there.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thanks.
Fascinating. We have a question from Samuel Foray, a journalist, I believe, joining us from France. And feel free to introduce yourself.
Hello. Actually, no, I just arrived in Jerusalem 3 months ago and planning to be correspondent for Le Figaro and Mediapart for the next 4 years. Hopefully, we'll see. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I'm just wanted to come back on the old city, and I was interested in knowing if the Temple Mount, Haram and Sharif is the last Palestinian political space in East Jerusalem.
I think it's not only political, it's the last governmental even. It's the last stronghold. It's the last place that represents Palestinian authority and some kind of governance or capacity of governance in an autonomous way in Jerusalem. As I mentioned in my lecture, in the 70s and during the 90s, the Palestinians manage and control their education system, their healthcare system, their transportation system, all of these, areas of services and all of these infrastructure that mediate the conduct of everyday life were pretty much Palestinian affiliated in terms of management, funding, and so on. Today, I think the only place, physical place, and also places in terms of identity that got left for Palestinians to, that is, beyond, to a certain extent, of Israel's reach, is the Haram al Sharif. As far as I I'm not, it's not my exactly specific subject of research, but this is the way I understand it. It's like the last stronghold of Palestinians in East Jerusalem in terms of urban space and functionality and so on.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Oren? Oren, well, this was really fascinating. And I'm looking forward to reading the articles. And we want to thank you. And we miss you at the Minerva Center and are thrilled that you're at the Open University. So thanks, everybody. Thank Oren. And we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Michal.
תודה רבה, היה מאוד מעניין.
ביי ביי, אלי.
להתראות.
Bye.